February 19, 1942, Washington, D.C. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt lifted his pen and signed Executive Order 9066. The document was brief, 2 pages. Legal language wrapped around a single, devastating purpose. It authorized the Secretary of War to designate military zones from which any or all persons may be excluded. The order never mentioned race. It didn't need to. Within weeks, posters appeared on telephone poles across California, Oregon, and Washington. Blocked letters commanded attention on cream-colored paper. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. The words hung in the morning air of American cities, nailed beside advertisements for war bonds and victory gardens, a bureaucratic mask for what was about to unfold. 120,000 people would lose everything, not because of what they had done, because of who they were. Mary Tsukamoto stood in her kitchen in Florin, California, reading the notice her neighbor had torn from a post. She was a teacher, American-born, 29 years old. Her husband ran a small strawberry farm they had built together, row by careful row, year after year. The notice gave them 7 days. 7 days to sell or store a lifetime. 7 days to pack only what they could carry. 7 days before they would be taken to an assembly center, the government's term for hastily converted horse stalls at racetracks and fairgrounds. Mary looked out her window at the strawberry fields. The fruit was just ripening. Another week, and they would have harvested. Instead, she began sorting through photographs, trying to decide which memories weighed little enough to bring. Her daughter, 5 years old, asked where they were going. Mary didn't know how to answer. "Somewhere safe," she finally said, the lie catching in her throat. The notices appeared in Seattle, in Portland, in Los Angeles. They appeared in farming communities where Japanese families had cultivated the land for generations, turning barren soil into abundant fields. They appeared in cities where second-generation Nisei ran grocery stores, flower shops, and restaurants. The instructions were specific, clinical. Families could bring only bedding, toilet articles, extra clothing, and essential personal effects. No pets, no contraband, no cameras, no shortwave radios, no weapons. Report to civil control stations for registration and transportation. Bring identification. Be ready to leave. What the notices didn't say was that most would never return to the lives they knew. In Terminal Island, near Los Angeles Harbor, the notice gave families 48 hours. Jean Wakatsuki was 7 years old. She watched her father burn his Japanese flag, the one he had kept from his time serving in the Japanese Merchant Marine decades earlier. He burned his ceremonial kimonos. He burned family photographs that showed relatives in Japan. He burned everything that might mark him as connected to the enemy. The smoke rose from the barrel in their backyard, carrying away pieces of identity that could be used as evidence of disloyalty in a country gripped by fear. Her father was a fisherman, had been until the FBI arrested him the day after Pearl Harbor, along with thousands of other Issei, first-generation immigrants who were not allowed to become citizens, forbidden by law for naturalization because of their race. He was held for months without charges, interrogated, released. Now the government wanted them gone entirely. The spring of 1942 moved with mechanical precision. Civilian exclusion orders divided the West Coast into numbered zones. Zone by zone, community by community, families reported. They came carrying suitcases and duffel bags, children clutching stuffed animals, elderly grandparents helped along by grown children. They came wearing their best clothes, as if dressing properly might somehow dignify what was happening. They came with identification tags tied to their coats, family numbers assigned by the government, reducing names to digits. At the Tan Foreign Assembly Center, south of San Francisco, families were assigned to horse stalls in the racetrack stables. The smell of manure still lingered. Partitions between stalls didn't reach the ceiling. There was no privacy, no dignity. Families of 6 or 7 crowded into spaces built for a single horse. At night, lying on straw mattresses on rough wooden floors, they could hear other families breathing, crying, arguing in whispers. The racetrack grandstands were visible from the stalls, a reminder that this place was built for spectators watching animals run. Now they were the ones being watched. By August 1942, the mass removal was complete. 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, were imprisoned behind barbed wire. 10 permanent camps scattered across desolate interior lands. Manzanar in California's Owens Valley, Tule Lake near the Oregon border, Poston and Gila River in the Arizona desert, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho, Topaz in Utah, Grenada in Colorado, Rower and Jerome in Arkansas swamplands. The government called them relocation centers. It refused to use the word that applied: concentration camps. The term was precise. These were places where civilians were imprisoned en masse based solely on their ancestry, held without trial, without charges, behind fences and guard towers. But America reserved that phrase for its enemies. For its own camps, it invented gentler language. Norman Mineta was 10 years old when his family arrived at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. The camp sat in the shadow of a distinctive peak that gave the facility its name, surrounded by sagebrush and dust, 15 miles from the nearest town. The barracks were identical. Tar paper-covered wooden buildings, 20 by 100 feet, divided into 6 one-room apartments. His family's room measured 20 by 20 feet for 6 people. A pot-bellied stove for heat. No insulation. Gaps in the floorboards let Wyoming wind whistle through. In winter, temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. In summer, they climbed past 100 degrees. The communal latrines had no partitions, no stalls. The mess halls served institutional food on metal trays, and surrounding it all, barbed wire fence, guard towers at each corner, searchlights that swept the camp at night. The machine guns in the towers pointed inward. Fred Korematsu was 23 when the exclusion orders came. He was born in Oakland, California, studied welding, played tennis, dated an Italian-American woman. When his family prepared to report for internment, Fred refused. He changed his name, had minor plastic surgery to alter his appearance, tried to pass as Hawaiian or Latino, anything but Japanese. He wanted to stay with his girlfriend, wanted to keep his life. On May 30th, 1942, police arrested him in San Bernardino. The American Civil Liberties Union approached him in jail,
They wanted to challenge the constitutionality of the internment. Fred agreed. His case, Korematsu versus United States, would reach the Supreme Court. But first, he was sent to Topaz. Inside the camps, life existed in limbo. People tried to create normalcy from barbed wire and dust. They planted gardens, coaxing vegetables from hostile soil. They organized schools in converted barracks, teaching American history to children imprisoned by the American government. They formed baseball leagues, Buddhist churches, Boy Scout troops. They published newspapers with names that carried cruel irony, the Manzanar Free Press. They held dances, weddings, funerals. They lived, because what else could they do? But beneath the surface, tension simmered. In February 1943, the government presented all male internees over 17 with a questionnaire. Questions 27 and 28 tore families apart.
Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Question 28. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? For the Nisei, second generation, American citizens by birth, the questions were a cruel paradox. The government that had stripped them of freedom, imprisoned them without trial, now demanded they prove their loyalty by volunteering to die. For the Issei, first-generation immigrants barred from citizenship, question 28 was a trap. If they forswore allegiance to Japan, they would become stateless, belonging nowhere. Some answered yes to both. Yes, yes. Some answered no to both. No, no. Families divided over the questions. Brothers stopped speaking to brothers. Fathers disowned sons. The no-no responses led to transfer to Tule Lake, designated as a segregation center for the disloyal. Over 18,000 people were sent there, not criminals, not spies, simply people who refused to pledge allegiance to a country that had betrayed them. But thousands answered yes, not because they forgave what had been done, because they wanted to prove what they had always known, that they were American. 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the United States military during World War II. Most came from the camps. The most famous unit was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans, many of whom left their families behind barbed wire to fight for the country that imprisoned them. Their motto, "Go for broke." Inoue was 18, a medical student in Hawaii when Pearl Harbor was attacked. He rushed to an aid station, treating the wounded as smoke still rose from the harbor. When the opportunity came to volunteer, he enlisted immediately. His father wept, not from pride, from fear that his son would die proving loyalty that should never have been questioned. Inoue joined the 442nd, trained at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where locals greeted them with suspicion and slurs. In June 1944, the 442nd deployed to Italy. The Lost Battalion operation would make them legends. The 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, 275 men from Texas, was surrounded by German forces in the Vosges Mountains of France. 7 battalions had tried to break through, failed. The 442nd was ordered in. For 6 days they fought through dense forest against entrenched German positions. They advanced meter by meter through machine gun fire and artillery. They suffered 800 casualties to rescue 211 men, more than a full casualty replacement to save less than a full battalion. Daniel Inouye's platoon was reduced from 40 men to 8. On April 21, 1945, near Santerenzo, Italy, Inouye led an attack on a German machine gun nest. A rifle grenade struck him in the abdomen. He kept advancing. He destroyed one machine gun nest with grenades. He was moving on a second when a German fired a rifle grenade at close range. The grenade struck his right elbow, nearly severing his arm. His hand, still gripping a live grenade, remained attached by shreds of tissue. Inouye pried the grenade from his dead hand's grip with his left hand and threw it, destroying the machine gun nest. He was shot in the leg. He continued firing his Thompson submachine gun left-handed until he collapsed. He would lose his arm. He would receive the Medal of Honor. 55 years later, when the military finally acknowledged that racism had prevented proper recognition during the war. The 442nd became the most decorated unit in American military history for its size and length of service. 18,143 individual decorations, 9,486 Purple Hearts, 21 Medals of Honor, most awarded in 2000 after a review found discrimination in the original awards, 4,000 wounded, over 600 killed. They fought in Italy, in France, in Germany. They liberated towns, freed concentration camps, broke German defensive lines. They earned the right to be called heroes, but their families remained in American concentration camps. At Tule Lake, the segregation center, conditions deteriorated into crisis. Over 18,000 people, the largest of all the camps, were crammed into space built for 15,000. The no-no prisoners, the troublemakers, the ones who asked too many questions. Protests erupted over conditions, over treatment, over the fundamental injustice. In November 1943, internees demonstrated against corruption and food shortages. The military declared martial law. Tanks rolled into Tule Lake. Soldiers with fixed bayonets marched through the camp. The military arrested protest leaders, held them in a stockade for months. They beat prisoners, denied medical care, kept men in unheated cells through winter. This was not Germany, not Japan. This was California, 1943.
The camps existed in a legal vacuum until December 18, 1944. That day, two announcements. The Supreme Court ruled in Korematsu versus United States, 6-3, upholding the constitutionality of the internment. Justice Hugo Black wrote that military necessity justified the exclusion, that the courts must defer to military judgment in wartime. Justice Robert Jackson dissented, warning that the court had validated a principle of racial discrimination that lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. The same day, the War Department announced that the exclusion orders would be rescinded, effective January 2, 1945. The camps would close. The internees could go home. Except there was no home to return to. Mary Tsukamoto's strawberry farm had been sold for a fraction of its value. The buyer refused to sell it back. Giane Wakatsuki's family returned to find their fishing boat gone, their home occupied by strangers. Fred Korematsu returned to Oakland facing a criminal conviction, unable to find work, shunned by some in his own community for fighting the government.
Across California, Oregon, Washington, signs appeared in shop windows. No Japs wanted, no Japs allowed. Some had never left. Vandals destroyed property, arsonists burned farms, vigilantes fired shots through windows. The government that had imprisoned them for their protection now offered no protection at all. Many internees had nothing to return to. They scattered across the country, trying to start over in cities where they weren't known, weren't marked. They rarely spoke of the camps. The shame was too deep. Not their shame, but America's, which somehow became theirs to carry. The children who grew up behind barbed wire carried invisible scars. George Takei was 5 years old when his family was sent to Rower, Arkansas, then Tule Lake. He remembered the searchlights, the guards, the barbed wire. He remembered his father trying to maintain dignity in conditions designed to strip it away. For decades afterward, he couldn't speak about it. The memory sat like a stone. Minoru Yasui, who challenged the curfew orders and was imprisoned, spent the rest of his life fighting for civil rights, trying to prevent what happened to him from happening to anyone else. Gordon Hirabayashi, another who challenged the exclusion orders, who was convicted and imprisoned, continued his case through the courts for decades. In the 1980s, their convictions were vacated, not overturned on appeal, vacated, because evidence emerged that the government had suppressed and destroyed evidence during the original trials. Evidence that Japanese Americans posed no security threat, that military necessity was a lie. The government had known from the beginning that there was no justification for the internment, and did it anyway. It took 46 years. On August 10, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. The government formally apologized for the internment.
It acknowledged that the actions were based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It authorized reparations, $20,000 to each surviving internee. The money couldn't restore lost farms, lost businesses, lost years. It couldn't erase the trauma, the shame, the betrayal. But it was an acknowledgement, an admission, a recognition that a wrong had been done. Fred Korematsu received his reparations check. He donated it to the Japanese American community, saying the money meant less than the recognition that he had been right to resist. In 1998, President Bill Clinton awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 2011, Acting Solicitor General Neil Katyal formally repudiated the government's wartime arguments in the Korematsu case. In 2018, in Trump v. Hawaii, Chief Justice Roberts explicitly rejected Korematsu, stating it was gravely wrong the day it was decided. But the decision has never been formally overturned. It remains on the books. Justice Jackson's loaded weapon waiting. Norman Mineta, who had been imprisoned as a child at Heart Mountain, became the first Asian American member of a presidential cabinet, serving as Secretary of Transportation. After 9/11, when fear and prejudice again threatened to strip Americans of their rights based on religion and ethnicity, Mineta fought against profiling. He remembered what fear had done before. Daniel Inouye became a United States Senator from Hawaii, serving for 50 years. He used his position to champion civil rights, to speak for the voiceless, to ensure the mistakes of 1942 were not repeated. When he died in 2012, he lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, the second Asian American so honored. George Takei became an actor, known to millions as Hikaru Sulu on Star Trek. But later in life, he became something more important, a voice for memory, speaking about the camps to anyone who would listen, ensuring that Americans never forget what their government did. The camps are mostly gone now. Manzanar is a National Historic Site, preserved as a reminder. Visitors can walk through reconstructed barracks, see the guard towers, imagine what it was like to live there. But most of the other camps have vanished. The barracks were sold as surplus after the war, hauled away by farmers who needed cheap lumber. The land returned to desert, to swamp, to emptiness. Only foundations remain, concrete slabs where buildings once stood, and plaques belatedly installed that say, "Here, Americans were imprisoned by their own government. Here, the Constitution failed. Here, fear defeated justice. Remember." There is a garden at the Manzanar Cemetery. Internees built it during their imprisonment, creating beauty in a place designed for suffering. A white monument stands at its center, an obelisk with Japanese characters that translate roughly as Soul Consoling Tower. It was erected in 1943 by internees to honor those who died in the camp. The garden still blooms. Descendants of the internees maintain it, tend it, returned year after year to pay respects, to remember, to ensure that the story isn't forgotten even as the survivors grow fewer. 120,000 people, 2/3 of them American citizens, imprisoned for no crime, held for years behind barbed wire, not because of what they had done, because of who they were, because fear is easier than justice, because prejudice wears the mask of security, because in a moment of crisis, a nation founded on liberty chose imprisonment.
The Japanese-American internment was not an accident. It was a choice, authorized by a president, upheld by the Supreme Court, carried out by ordinary Americans following orders. It happened because good people remained silent, because lawyers crafted legal justifications for injustice, because military commanders prioritized convenience over rights, because politicians feared backlash more than they feared tyranny. It happened because it was allowed to happen. The children of the camps are old now. Their children and grandchildren carry the stories forward, holding tight to memories that are not their own, but belong to them nonetheless. They speak at schools, at museums, at commemorations. They say, "This happened here, in America, to Americans." They say, "Remember," not to create division, not to assign blame to those who were not there, but to ensure that when fear comes again, and it always comes again, there are voices that remember what fear can do when it is allowed to govern. Executive Order 9066 was formally rescinded by President Gerald Ford in 1976, but its legacy remains. In every debate about security versus freedom, in every call to register, restrict, or detain groups based on religion or ethnicity, in every moment when Americans must choose between safety and justice, the camps stand as a warning. This is what happens when a nation forgets that rights are not conditional, that liberty is not a luxury to be suspended when it becomes inconvenient, that justice requires courage, especially when fear demands surrender. Mary Tsukamoto spent the rest of her life teaching about the camps. She spoke to students, to teachers, to anyone who would listen. She said, "I want people to know what happened, not to create hate, but to create understanding, so it never happens again." She died in 2007
at age 91. Her strawberry farm is gone, but her voice remains. All their voices remain, in archives and oral histories, in museums and memorials, in the memories passed down through generations, in the reminder that freedom is fragile, that justice must be defended, that rights, once surrendered, are not easily reclaimed. Stand at Manzanar today. The wind blows through empty spaces where barracks once stood. The mountains rise in the distance, beautiful and indifferent. The guard towers are gone. The barbed wire is gone. Only the foundations remain, and the cemetery garden, and the white monument with its simple inscription. But if you listen, really listen, you can almost hear them. 120,000 voices, American voices, saying, "Remember. Remember what was done here. Remember what we endured. Remember what we lost. Remember so that you never let it happen again. To anyone, for any reason, ever." The Japanese-American internment was not America's darkest hour. It was one of many, a moment when fear triumphed over principle, when prejudice wore the mask of patriotism, when a nation betrayed its own ideals. But it was also a moment of extraordinary courage, of families who maintained dignity in degradation, of young men who fought for a country that imprisoned them, of individuals who resisted when resistance seemed futile, of communities that rebuilt when everything was lost, of survivors who spoke when silence would have been easier. Their courage didn't erase the injustice, but it illuminated what justice requires. Not perfection, but persistence. Not silence in the face of wrong, but speaking even when your voice shakes. Not forgetting, because forgetting is how history repeats. If this story moved you, if it made you remember the names time tried to erase, the faces hidden behind numbers, the voices silenced behind barbed wire, then carry it forward. Share it. Teach it. Remember it. Subscribe and help us ensure that these stories, uncomfortable as they are, essential as they are, never fade into silence. Because the dead cannot speak, but we can speak for them. And we must.